The first thing we need to do is to get the car to a safe place. There's a risk of damage to the tyre, certainly if you drive a car when the tyre is flat, but the most important thing is the location you're at where you're going to change the tyre is somewhere that's safe. Ideally it should be flat or as flat as possible and a good surface for the jack to work on. Remember that the jack that you've got with the car, if you've got a jack, is not the same as the kind of jack that would be used in a garage or a fast fit tyre centre. It's designed purely for the purposes of an emergency wheel change, and so the best conditions you can give the car to do this job in, the better it'll be for you. First thing, of course, is not to panic. Before you start, make sure you have got a spare wheel, because not all modern cars come with spare wheels. They may have some form of inflation device, but if you've got a spare wheel and a jack, once you've got the car in a safe place, the next thing to do is to get together all the things you need to do so the amount of time the car is up in the air is as short as possible. Fortunately, this car has a normal size spare wheel, but many cars, even if they do have a spare wheel, will be a space saver. It'll be thinner and operating at much higher pressures. There'll be a warning sign somewhere on the thing to tell you the limits of speed and distance, but in any event, the object of the exercise should be to get the tyre sorted and the correct tyre back on the car as soon as possible. The jack and the wheel brace need to be ready for you, and of course, if you have a warning triangle, this should be placed in an appropriate location to the rear of the vehicle to warn traffic coming up behind you, especially if you're in a rural area. If the car's not on perfectly level ground, and sometimes it can be quite difficult to find a suitable place to change your wheel, if you've got something, just a wedge under the wheel, or even look around for something that you can improvise with to make sure the car doesn't roll. Of course, you need to have the handbrake on and the car in gear before you start this. The next thing to do is to look for where the jacking point is on the vehicle if you're not familiar with it. In some cases, as on this car here, there'll be a mark somewhere on the sill to tell you where the jack goes. Start to unwind the jack. Get the jack into position, make sure it's on firm ground, but don't start to lift the car yet. Just make sure it's correctly positioned and you've got the jack into position. Modern car is likely to have 4 or 5 wheel bolts rather than nuts, and if the car has alloy wheels, it will almost certainly have a locking wheel nut. Before you start, you need to make sure you've got the locking wheel nut key with you. It may be kept in the boot with the jack and the spare wheel, or on some cars it will be in the glove box. It usually looks like a conventional socket and simply fits into the wheel brace and onto the locking wheel nut. Although changing a wheel hasn't really changed much since the invention of the motor car, there are some little details that might be different between cars. We've still got on this car an indication of where to put the jack, and we've still got alloy wheels, but in this case there are plastic caps over the wheel nuts, so when we go to put our wheel brace on, we might be surprised to find it doesn't fit. We might also have wondered what this device was for that lives with the jack in the spare wheel well, and the answer is it's designed to hook the plastic caps off so that the wheel brace fits. The advantage, of course, of the plastic caps is we should find that the bolts underneath are clean, haven't rusted up, and might be slightly easier to remove. Once we've just loosened them slightly, we can start to lift the car. Remember, if the wheel is flat, the car will be much closer to the ground, and you need to lift the car enough that you'll be able to put an inflated tyre back onto the car. Start to lift the car using the jack, remembering that it's not unusual for a few creaks as it goes up. Just make sure it's steady as it goes, but don't panic too much. After we've got the last bolt out, you may find that the wheel itself is quite stiff to remove from the rim, and that can be because of an interaction between the alloy of the wheel and the steel of the hub. Then we bring the spare wheel on and lift it into place. Remember to rotate it to line up with the holes. Of course, this was another task that was easier in the olden days when you had studs and nuts, because it was easier to locate the wheel on. And feed the bolts in. Make sure you put each of them in first before attempting to tighten anything. And here's the final locking wheel nut. And our convenient reminder to use the correct bolts, here the hollow ones, and that our speed is limited to 80 kilometers an hour while we've got this far on. The spare wheel, when a car has alloy wheels, will almost always be steel. If it is, it may be that there are different bolts used to put the spare wheel back on. If that's the case, you'll usually find them in the boot with the spare wheel or perhaps with the locking wheel nuts, and there will be a clear indication as here to tell you which bolts to use. Before letting the car back down to the ground, tighten up the bolts, making sure that the tyre is seated. The bolts are usually dished slightly to make sure the wheel sits flat against the hub. We don't need to worry about doing them up too tightly at the moment because we're going to tighten them fully when the car's back on the ground. Don't tighten the bolts in order around the wheel, tighten diagonally opposite each time, which helps to make sure that the bolts pull the wheel flat against the hub. Once the tyre's on and correctly flat against the wheel, we can lower the car again. One of the disadvantages of changing a wheel when we have alloy wheels, often with large low profile tyres and a space saver spare, is actually finding enough room in the boot to put the flat tyre while we take it to somewhere to be properly repaired, or sadly more probably in this day and age, replaced. You'll need to wind the jack all the way down because in most cases it won't fit back in the boot unless it's been lined down. With the car back on the ground, we now need to tighten the bolts properly, and again importantly working diagonally opposite each time. Of course you're checking your tyre pressures regularly on all of the wheels including the spare, but once you've got it all back together and the car's back on its spare, you need to do something about your punctured tyre. That's the time where you need to get to the nearest Trust My Garage who can sort out your tyre and probably check the pressure in the spare while they're at it.